Tracy suffered from driving anxiety for years. She avoided driving more than a few blocks from home, and she avoided driving in traffic, over bridges and overpasses. She avoided highways, and she even avoided stoplights. If she did drive in town, she always had someone in the car with her. Now, her phobia started when she had a panic attack while driving years ago and has struggled ever since. Now, today I'm going to describe how to treat driving phobia or driving anxiety, and it's often experienced by people that are also suffering from agoraphobia. Agoraphobia is an intense fear of becoming overwhelmed or unable to escape or get help, and it's often triggered by leaving places outside of their home, like driving or traveling by public transportation. Now, although some people can have driving anxiety without agoraphobia, now, people have difficulty recovering from driving phobia for several reasons. Common behaviors that reinforce and maintain driving anxiety include the following. They misinterpret anxiety symptoms as being harmful or dangerous, and some have a fear that while experiencing anxiety symptoms, it may cause them to have a car accident or to lose control or possibly have a medical emergency. They practice avoidance behaviors that reinforce their anxiety. They may avoid things like driving alone, driving to a certain distance from home, and maybe driving in less familiar places, on highways, in traffic, over bridges, overpasses, in remote areas, in bad weather, at night, when feeling anxious or tired, or maybe when they have an upset stomach, they feel like they're afraid they might get sick, or they're afraid that they might have to use the restroom. Now, they use different safety cues and safety behaviors, like bringing food and water with them, having a tranquilizing medication just in case, having a cell phone, maybe mapping out bathrooms and exits, hospitals, escape routes, driving very slowly, having someone in the car following them, or maybe in the car with them. They often restrict their eating and drinking liquids and food before they drive, and they really grasp that steering wheel tight. They might try different relaxation methods or breathing techniques to try to calm themselves and escape those anxiety symptoms. Now, they may also use all different kinds of distraction, like trying to listen to music or a podcast, something to distract them from feeling their anxiety. And they often kind of white knuckle it. They push through it. They get through it as fast as they can. They don't want to feel it. So all of these behaviors and more reinforce the anxiety, and it really trains the brain that anxiety and anxiety symptoms and driving is dangerous. And those two experiences get really wired together in the brain, and then they occur together. So how do you treat and recover from a driving phobia? Well, to recover from anxiety and a phobia, you expose yourself to what you fear. Now, that sounds simple, right? But there's a lot to consider here. So let me review a few basics on how to do exposure therapy. Let's talk a little bit more about planning and doing your exposures. I'm going to list some key elements that you may want to consider and to work into your exposure plan. Number 1, begin a daily exposure journal and write about why you want to work on your driving anxiety. What can you tell yourself that's going to keep you motivated even during those difficult exposures? Perhaps you want to gain your freedom of movement and independence, or travel, or maybe start a new career, or you have to provide for your family, or perhaps you're just wanting to experience a more fulfilling life. Write about the why to help you firm up your motivation during treatment. Next, list your goals. What exactly you want to be able to do. This list includes usually what you've been avoiding. For example, I want to be able to drive on the highway alone. I want to drive without the fear of having a panic attack. I want to drive alone within 50 miles of my house. I want to drive over bridges and overpasses. I want to drive in heavy traffic in Atlanta and Chicago. Whatever it is that you want, create your list. Then, under your goals, come up with a list of exposures that will get you there. Now, this doesn't have to be a complete list. You can always add and take off, as you go. And you can break these down into, the smaller steps if you'd like. We don't really create hierarchies anymore because the order of exposures doesn't matter as much. But most people start with a milder exposure and then they increase how much they're going to challenge themselves as they gain their confidence. You're in control and you can decide daily how much you want to challenge yourself. Most people realize that they can do much more than they anticipated once they get going. Next, write down a list of your safety behaviors. Everything that you may do that gives you this feeling of a little bit more safety. Now, safety behaviors, it's just an illusion. Having water there doesn't keep you safe. It's an illusion. But there may be loads of these behaviors that you've never considered before, but you're doing, and it's reinforcing the anxiety. So anything besides jumping in your car with your driver's license is probably a safety behavior. Next, identify your distraction behaviors. And these are the things that you're doing, like trying to relax and breathing techniques, listening to the radio, anything that you're doing to try to distract you from feeling the anxiety in the moment. So plan your exposures ahead of time. Plan the who, what, when, why, where, how long of the exposure. Plan what you're going to work on avoiding and what safety behaviors and distraction behaviors you're going to resist. For example, you might resist having a person with you for the day or talking to somebody on the phone while you're driving. Whatever you're going to resist in that challenge, identify that. Now, there's no real rules about how long you have to stay in your exposure. Instead, we want you to stay in the exposure until you feel like you've learned something. Now, I know that sounds very vague, but you are going to understand what that means when you start feeling that when you're doing the exposures. You want to have this sense of what you were afraid was going to happen didn't happen. Now, generally, I recommend that people plan roughly an hour a day to work on their exposures. Now, there's some evidence that flooding, and that means really challenging yourself, creates faster learning and recovery. So in flooding, you're doing a longer, a more challenging exposure rather than kind of working your way up gradually. Now, both methods work. The gradual method works, flooding method works. I promote starting with a milder exposure to gain confidence at the beginning, and then mix up those exposures where some days you're really challenging yourself, other days you might be doing a little bit more routine exposures. And I think this mixing it up is really good for exposure work. Now, even though I said to plan everything ahead of time, I want you to add this element of surprise and spontaneity to every exposure. So let's say that you plan to drive on the highway for 20 minutes, get off at a certain exit, and then drive home. And you were resisting maybe listening to the radio, and you decided to put your cell phone in the back seat just to challenge yourself. Now, for most people, when they turn around in an exposure and they start to drive to home, they notice that their anxiety begins to drop. The brain knows that they're going home. And when your brain learns best if you keep it surprised. So I encourage you to do something unexpected. Challenge your brain. Maybe you take a different route home that you've never taken before. Maybe you make a loop and you do the exposure again. Maybe you make a stop and you go into a store and you decide that just at the moment. Keeping your brain surprised with something unexpected when you're doing your exposures really helps amp up that learning and helps those exposures to be more effective. So that brings me to the next point, and that is to vary your exposures. Don't keep repeating the exact same one over and over again every day. Our fear can generalize driving to pretty much every situation, but exposures don't generalize very well. And that means that they only work on the car that you're in, the street that you're going down, and we want to help you generalize your exposures. So this means you have to constantly change it up. If you can jump into a different car and do an exposure, do that. If you can, Do different routes, drive during different conditions, low traffic, high traffic, different times of the day, different weather conditions. Now, most of your exposures will eventually, you'll need to be doing them alone, but you can vary sometimes with if people are in the car or not. The more that you vary your exposures, the greater success you're going to have in exposure therapy. Now, there's some evidence that doing your exposures within 6 hours of a sleep or nap helps your brain to consolidate that learning into your long-term memory. And it can also help the learning process if you do an exposure and then you take a brief break, like a 10-minute break, and then you do another exposure. Now, there is some evidence that taking a benzodiazepine and other tranquilizers that it may interfere with the memory consolidation in the brain. So I just want to advise you to not change medications without discussing this with your medical providers. And you can go to benzoinfo.com for more information. I encourage you also to verbalize what you're noticing in your body as you're doing your exposure. You can tell yourself what I call kind of realistic, objective statements about what you're experiencing. Part of recovery includes changing your thoughts and your interpretations to be less fearful. For example, you might say something like, I'm noticing a tightness in my chest, or I'm a tingling or numbness in my arms and legs, or I'm noticing my heart's racing. I'm noticing that my breathing is feeling more labored. I'm noticing a lump in my throat. I'm noticing that I'm thinking I have to find a bathroom. These are all objective statements. Now, there's no fear here. There's no, oh no, I think I'm going to panic. Oh no, I might pass out. Oh no, so that kind of thinking has to change. That is your sure way to get your brain to go right into fight or flight, is to add those fearful thoughts. So this is also a good time to talk about what to do if you do have a panic attack while you're driving. And you can have occasional, panic or high anxiety while you're doing exposures, even if you've had several really great weeks. I advise people to keep driving through their high anxiety and panic if they can. Now, if you feel as though you absolutely must pull over, you can pull over. But after a few minutes, I want you to start again and continue your exposure. Now, the best time to do exposures is while you're feeling anxious and panicked. Now, I know that nobody wants to do that, but this is how the brain learns. That the brain learns that you're safe, you're unconcerned, you can drive through these high anxiety symptoms. Panic symptoms are not dangerous or harmful, as you know. And so if you can continue to drive through it, you're really going to be helping yourself. Now, occasionally, even if you've done everything right for weeks and have had great exposures, occasionally you're going to have a bad exposure. The brain just jumps off the track of the new safety learning, and you end up having high anxiety or panic. Now, research shows that having these occasional bad exposures or panic experience actually makes your recovery stronger, makes the exposures better. And you're also learning that you can tolerate and cope through it. In that daily exposure journal that I mentioned, I also recommend that you use it to plan these daily exposures. And then you write down afterwards, this is very important, write down what happened and what you learned. It helps your brain to consolidate that learned information that you had in that exposure into your long-term memory. And then I want you to also, at that point, note what the exposure you're going to do tomorrow and how you're going to change it up. Now, I know this is difficult stuff. I'm talking about it as if it's easy. I have a passion in working for people that are suffering from agoraphobia, including driving anxiety, and I understand the commitment that is needed to overcome this condition and recover. You can do it. You can get your freedom back. Don't let sadness or feeling helpless stop you. You are not defective. You're not weak. Every single exposure is a step forward. So please practice self-compassion, celebrate, acknowledge every single victory. Progress is not linear. You're going to have good days, you're going to have bad days, but hang in there. I have more resources to help you at paigepradco.com. So until next time, I will see you in session. Take care. Bye-bye.